The crimson sunlight illuminated a grand edifice crafted from dark stone, nestled amidst the forest, resembling more of a castle with its myriad windows, beautiful verdant courtyard, and towers. The room housed opulent white furniture adorned with gilded accents and statues, while paintings adorned the walls. A young lady, her long tresses the color of marshes, traversed the hall donned in a shirt and a simple gown. She sought a diminutive lord. Approaching the loftiest statue within the chamber, she discovered the little lord. The boy, with his vibrant violet gleaming eyes, concealed himself behind the sculpture and rejoiced upon sighting his mentor. Had he known of her telepathic abilities, he would not have behaved so naively in her presence. His jet-black hair and indigo-hued eyes were distinct characteristics of the Scheffel family, from which the boy descended. Young Master Fred was a direct descendant of the vampire hunter, Duke Scheffel, and his sole heir. Now, it was the teacher's turn to hide. The little lord agreed, and eagerly embarked on the search. The mentor cast a cold gaze upon him. Suddenly, her own figure materialized, but in a more demented form, with white hair. Then, everything returned to normal. The boy had already turned away, closing his eyes while counting to 100. In the mentor's mind, a voice urged her to find him when the little lord matured. Grown-up Lord Fred plunged his sword into the bosom of the fair-haired teacher. They smiled, locking eyes with one another. The instructor yearned for him to end her with a single painless strike. Lord Fred became little once again, as he stood with his back turned, counting. The heir of Duke Scheffel was destined to be his teacher's executioner. And this was the moment the mentor had long awaited. The body of the young lady descended to the river. She leaped from the bridge, driven by an intense desire for death. The protagonist awoke in an unfamiliar chamber. Night had fallen outside. Initially, she thought she might be in a hospital, but as she adjusted her white locks, she was astonished to find a glove upon her hand. This place was certainly unlike the realm of the afterlife. Now the young lady realized she had even failed in her own suicide attempt. The scent of blood permeated the room. She felt a thirst, so she descended below, following the aroma, and consumed 2 goblets in quick succession. All of this seemed like a jest. The heroine began to piece together her thoughts to form a comprehensive picture of her circumstances. She found herself in a cold wooden house hidden within the forest, with a slaughterhouse in the basement and blood. Her eyes were crimson, her teeth sharp and white. Only one obvious conclusion presented itself in her mind. The young lady had become a vampire. Now she would be unable to die properly, for after her leap from the bridge, she had landed in an immortal body. The young lady experimented with various methods to bid farewell to life. A silver dagger, garlic, crosses, but nothing worked. The vampiress resorted to the most effective means, a stake made of aspen wood. It was excruciatingly painful, yet she did not perish. All her attempts had failed. The vampiress descended to the slaughterhouse and seized the first knife she laid eyes on. In despair, she pressed it against her throat and swiftly drew it across. The heroine remained alive. The vampiress attempted starvation. The young lady suffered, but she could not meet her demise in this world in any way. At first, the man presumed she was a wealthy foreigner wandering about, but it turned out not to be the case. He fell to his knees and bowed low, hastily apologizing. The man mentioned he didn't have change for the gold coin. A commotion ensued. The vampiress turned around anxiously. The slightly overweight merchant threw a young man with dark violet hair out onto the street for not paying for something. The lad attempted to borrow money from another merchant, who flatly refused. Jack had gained a reputation as an idler throughout the village. The young man grew indignant and began to praise himself. He was Jack Scheffel, a vampire hunter. Upon hearing this, the girl dragged him along. She stopped in the forest and hurled a bag of gold coins at his face. The heroine requested an answer to her question. Scheffel's eyes sparkled at the sight of the coins, and he agreed. The vampiress inquired about methods of vampire slaying, as he came from a family of hunters. He mentioned 3 techniques: sunlight, a stake made of aspen wood, and silver weaponry, but they proved ineffective. Scheffel gazed at the girl with incomprehension, for such a situation could only arise if the vampire was a Moon Lord. She horrifyingly connected 2 facts: Moon Lord and Scheffel. That was the name of the protagonist in a novel the girl had once read while still alive. The Hunter and the Saint was a novella about the vampire hunter Fred and the saint Cynthia. Fred's objective was to lift the curse from the Scheffel family. His long-standing adversary, the Moon, the mistress of the moon, was the entity inhabiting the main heroine's body. To break the curse, Fred attempted to defeat the Moon, but he himself suffered defeat and sustained grave wounds. Cynthia saved him after his defeat. During Fred's healing process in the temple, Cynthia awakened him as a saint, and the two resolved to join forces. Something peculiar was transpiring. If the maiden truly became the mistress of the moon, she would possess numerous abilities and formidable powers. According to the novella, the mistress of the moon could even summon darkness and manipulate it, concealing herself within shadows. In some respects, fortune had smiled upon her. In the novella, Fred and Cynthia emerged triumphant over the moon. However, there was one problem: pain. The mistress remained impervious to any wounds, except those inflicted by Fred and Cynthia. The moon experienced perpetual agony. Hence, the maiden would have to endure the same torments. The moon scrutinized Jack attentively. His violet hair and eyes resembled Fred's, but Jack bore no resemblance to him. This young man appeared pitiful and repulsive. Fred could certainly not be his progenitor. Yet in the novella, when Fred was born, his family went bankrupt. One day, Fred was sent on a quest to find his family's lost sword. He wasted much time and effort in vain due to erroneous information. However, the vampires could ensure that the sword never disappeared at all. Then Fred would not have to waste his time on that task and could devote his full attention to honing his skills and vanquishing the mistress of the moon with a single strike. The maiden smiled, anticipating her plan. She would care for this generation of Scheffels and those to come. Thus began a long-term project entitled Nurturing the Scheffel Family. The moon handed Jack a sack of golden coins to settle his debts initially. Jack squandered the first sum of money he received at the casino, then proceeded to get drunk and sprawl on the street. On a cool, dark morning, the girl led unsuspecting Jack into the forest. A colossal bear-like monster appeared behind the lad. Jack scrambled up a tree and clung to it. The moon surmised that the Scheffel family's talents would awaken in the heat of battle, but nothing happened. Subsequently, she commenced training him every day. After a year of rigorous training, he finally honed his skills and conquered his fears. Over time, Jack became an exceptional vampire hunter. In his final moments, Jack implored the moon to aid his daughter. Jack Scheffel's successor, his daughter Marin Scheffel, was intelligent and honorable. Marin became obsessed with hunting monsters, which helped her turn vampire hunting into a business, gather mercenaries, and establish the Scheffel lineage. After the demise of Marin Scheffel, the moon clandestinely supported her family to avoid revealing her true identity to future generations. The Scheffels acquired a noble title, amassed wealth, and wielded power. The Scheffel sword, known as Nihil, was crafted around the same era. Nihil was forged from purple ore that descended from the heavens through the artistry of magic. It was a special blade capable of withstanding the mistress of the moon. In the novel, during the battle with the Scheffel family, the moon shattered Nihil into fragments. Eventually, the shards of the sword were collected over 13 generations, and one of them came into the possession of the moon. However, the peaceful life of the Scheffels was short-lived. At that time, the kingdom coveted the power of the vampire hunting family, so they were sent off to war. They perished one by one. The moon resolved to alter the course of the war. She assassinated the general of the enemy army. The carnage finally came to an end. Due to their contribution to the victory, the Scheffel family caught the attention of the Duke family. Although the moon's memories of the past were fading, the contents of the novel were documented in books, making it effortless for her to refresh her recollection. One day, a boy was born into the Scheffel family. His name was Fred Scheffel. The moon was elated. Finally, the day she had eagerly awaited had arrived. Baby Fred cried in his cradle when the moon appeared before him. The young woman took a plush toy from Fred's crib and showed it to the little one. He calmed down, and with a dissatisfied expression, the moon shook the toy in front of Fred while he gazed at her with his blissful violet eyes. With his tiny hand, Fred grasped the moon's finger. She froze. Though his power seemed feeble for now, once he hones his skills in the future, he will be unparalleled. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open. The moon vanished. The maid was surprised because she distinctly heard someone's voice. One evening in the courtyard of the Scheffel mansion, the servants gathered. All looked astonished in one direction. They spoke of how he managed to undergo training as a junior knight when he was only 7 years old, without practicing from morning till night. Young yet confident Master Fred defeated a fellow youth, Moon observed with slight astonishment from the sidelines. Despite his tender age, his aura was extraordinary. The other courtiers only noticed it now, but the current duke of the family, Keely Scheffel, began instructing Fred as soon as he took his first steps. The attendants didn't want to overexert the child, but Keely disregarded their concerns. At the age of 5, despite his frail physique, Fred underwent the same training as the knights. When he was 7 years old, he triumphed over a junior knight. Moon gradually had to reduce her visits here, partly because of what happened last time. One day, when Fred was playing with a ball, he threw it over the fence. On the other side, the seated Moon accidentally threw it back. The young woman forgot that there shouldn't be a soul around the Duke's estate. When Fred recounted that someone immediately returned the ball over the fence, Duke Keely ordered the surroundings to be searched and the security to be reinforced. In the original novel, due to Fred's untapped talent, he struggled desperately to wield the sword. But now, everything is different because there are people nurturing Fred's talents. Suddenly, the Moon perceived the scent of blood and heard the sounds of labored breathing, as if someone were on the verge of suffocation. Indeed, in the forest, leaning against a tree, a fair-haired little boy was oozing blood. Approaching him was a tall man wielding a sword. Behind him emerged a silhouette, around which darkness gathered in thick clusters. The voice instructed the man to conclude what he intended to do and depart. The shadow dispersed, revealing the mistress of the Moon. The vampiress pierced the man with her chains. Wolves inhabited the depths of the wilderness. They regarded the Moon as their mistress and listened attentively. The vampiress could not feast on that man, as he repulsed her, so she commanded her pets to do it. The contented wolves began to approach the bloody boy, but before him materialized the Moon's shadow. The child remained conscious, still able to discern her countenance through a hazy veil, shimmering silver locks and crimson eyes. Perhaps the child beheld his final dream. She bitterly envied him. Suddenly, a piercing bite was heard. During the day, the palace dwellers searched for the boy in the forest. They failed to find any evidence. It seemed as though blood simply fell from the sky. The captain approached the very spot where the boy lay. Whether he was alive or dead, they needed to find proof. If they failed to concoct something, they would incur the displeasure of both sides. Both the queen and the concubine had to witness the second prince to remain content. If indeed he was deceased, everyone would face dire consequences. The Moon cradled the prince. Night still reigned. The boy bore a mark upon his neck from the sharp fangs of a vampire. Disapprovingly, the Moon cast a glance at a certain individual seated at the table, expressing that the prince remained unresponsive. It was the indifferent Dr. Jemina, deeming the boy lifeless. Skeptically, the Moon surveyed the child. Her descendant could not perish. Jemina sprang from her seat to examine him. The doctor lifted the boy into her arms and carried him to another chamber for cleansing. The mistress returned to her quarters. Dr. Jemina, being the foremost monster researcher, became a target for various peculiar factions. It was the Moon who saved Jemina when she was abducted by monsters. The doctor also played a role in the novel Hunter and the Saint. Her extraordinary value manifested when it came to crafting special elixirs to combat monsters. She could concoct any potion, even a poison capable of slaying the Moon's sovereign. Jemina returned with the sleeping boy cradled in her arms. She washed him and dressed him in a surgical ensemble. Based on his condition, the doctor deduced that the boy was around 12 years old. He was in the stage of maturation. According to the doctor's research findings, vampires undergo 2 stages of development before entering their golden age. The boy was supposed to awaken at the end of his maturation period, but Jemina could not determine the exact timing. It was the first time she had observed such a rare occurrence. Jemina turned and gazed at the Moon. Previously, the vampiress had not desired offspring. Jemina took her hand and smiled, requesting that the Moon entrust the boy to her. This month, she would replace the monster with this child. Her mind was already filled with a myriad of experiments. The Moon surrendered the monster's remains, and in return, Jemina devised her concoctions. This signified that the second prince would become a remarkably valuable specimen. The vampiress' heritage was the dominion over the moon. If she were to surrender this child, significant progress in monster research could potentially be achieved. The moon declined. In the original story, the moon's mistress had no heirs, and the boy was not utilized as a subject of study. Consequently, the course of the original narrative could be disrupted. Little is known about how vampires inherit their unique abilities. Nonetheless, it is evident that an indescribable bond exists between them, which is inherently difficult for anyone else to comprehend. The mistress of the moon possessed devastating power. She and Gemina had crossed paths 7 years ago. The portrayal of the mistress stood in stark contrast to vivacity and immaturity. She proposed to the frightened Gemina to craft a poison that could kill the moon's sovereign in exchange for her own life. Many years had passed since that moment. Gemina began provoking the moon, seeking to incite the vampiress' anger. She succeeded. A dark aura began to gather around the moon. It was then that Gemina, with a smile, declared that the vampiress no longer knew why she desired death. Darkness pierced through Gemina's body. The moon tightened her grip around her throat, suffocating the doctor. Through the pain, Gemina lifted her head. The moon remained unchanged. Her crimson eyes, devoid of any trace of sympathy, gazed upon Gemina. That gaze had remained unaltered ever since. Gemina deliberately provoked the moon, and she understood it all too well. It was an evening. The prince slumbered upon the bed of the moon. 3 years had elapsed since the moon had taken him in. This year, Fred would turn 10. It had been quite some time since the moon had laid eyes on him. The time had come to visit the children of Harnan. The Duke Benjamin knocked on Fred's chamber door. Tears streamed down the man's face as he implored Fred to come out, if only to cast a glance upon him. And there stood the moon. The mistress of the moon decided to make a brief stop at the Scheffel mansion before heading to the Hornans. However, something grave had occurred here, considering that the protagonist had locked himself inside his room. According to the plot of the novel Hunter and the Saint, Fred and Cynthia fell in love, matured together, and vanquished the moon's sovereign. The vampiress had no choice but to intervene to ensure this encounter finally took place. Finally, the day arrived. The moon, in her human guise, graced the hall of the Scheffel family's fame. A young man accompanied her, showcasing various sculptures to her. The moon followed him, listening attentively. Then they were invited to the banquet hall, where Duke Benjamin awaited them. The moon and the Duke took their seats at the table. Benjamin had heard of the moon's good relations with the Hornan family and mentioned it to her. The young woman nodded. She had previously been an instructor to Lord Hornan's children. This family harbored numerous secrets, thus the moon's true identity was known to only a few. Despite their relatively short history, the Hornans wielded considerable influence, being favored by the Emperor himself. Due to their covert role as spies, very little was known about them. Nevertheless, the enigmatic nature of the Hornans provided the moon with ample cover to conceal her own identity. The Duke assured her that what transpired here would remain a secret. With a tense expression, he lowered his head and clasped his hands. Rumors about Fred had circulated, and the young woman confirmed that she had received news of the heir's illness. Benjamin led the moon to Fred's chamber, knocking on the door and introducing the young woman as the new tutor for his son. It turned out that Fred did not need her presence. Judging by his response, the boy had not completely shut himself off from everyone. Moon mustered the courage to enter, despite a couple of people suffering from Fred hurling objects at them. The girl stepped inside, finding the boy sitting in a corner. Moon introduced herself, but Fred grabbed a book and made a sudden attempt to strike her with it. She swiftly intercepted his action, surprising Fred. The boy revealed his face to Moon, who warmly smiled at him. However, Fred once again began to drive her away, fearing that he might harm Moon. The vampiress raised her hand to gently caress Fred's head. In a moment of panic, Scheffel struck her, albeit unwittingly. Moon neither became frightened nor angered. Instead, she tenderly stroked his hair. Fred guiltily looked at Moon's hand, but she reassured him that everything was fine, despite feeling a slight pain. Everyone around warned against approaching Fred, be it adults or children. If he were to strike someone else, the bones of an ordinary person would shatter. Fred possessed far too much power for a 10-year-old child. Attempts were made to forcibly remove him, but he broke a man's arm right in front of the courtiers, including his own father, Duke Benjamin. Fred didn't do it intentionally. He simply couldn't control his strength. The boy was unwilling to leave the room, but everyone pressured him, except for Moon. If Fred found comfort in remaining there, she would intervene from this point onward, halting anyone who attempted to extract him. Scheffel wept tears of joy, for the first time experiencing someone who understood and accepted him. All descendants of the Scheffel family are cursed from birth. Ironically, this curse compelled them to fight monsters until the end of their lives. Despite individual differences, family members possessed unimaginable power and talents inaccessible to ordinary people. But Fred was different, the greatest talent of all time. Although the gift usually manifests and develops closer to adolescence, it awakened in Fred much earlier, and his power was immeasurable. The reason for this was that the child's body could not handle it. Even the moon could not control his power. The girl opened the door to Fred's room. A chair flew at her, but Moon caught it. The teacher, as usual, just smiled and caressed the weeping Fred on the head. If they didn't warn him upon entering the room, he would immediately commence defending himself like a monstrous entity. However, monsters do not confine themselves to shield others. The vampire's attempts to abstain from intervening merely resulted in her exerting greater influence on the situation. Nevertheless, if Fred's physical constitution couldn't endure it, Moon's plan for a swift and painless demise would falter. She resolved to educate him in mastering his power. First, Fred and she needed to tiddy up, as they couldn't engage in a game of ball due to the shards of shattered glass on the floor. Yet it shattered nonetheless, unable to withstand Fred's strength. The boy slumped and apologized, and Moon once again encouraged him. Fred's strength surpassed the vampire's expectations. They certainly required a more resilient ball. Moon arrived at the Hornin Manor. Count Alan Hornin himself emerged to greet her, fully aware that the vampire would come, for it was his domain. Moon expressed her gratitude for the recommendations that aided her in securing the new occupation. Hornin remarked that he did it in remembrance of their former friendship. They entered another chamber, leaving the attendants behind. Suddenly, the Count knelt down and began apologizing to Moon. It transpired that the mistress of the Hornin Manor was none other than the Moon Mistress herself. The secret of this esteemed lineage, and the true rationale behind the vampire being referred to as the instructor of this bloodline, lay in the fact that it had been created for this very purpose from the very beginning. Moon encountered the progenitor of the Hornin family amidst the turmoil that followed the war. The continent lay ravaged by conflict, and the accursed forest, which served as Moon's sanctuary, was dwindling due to battles and deforestation. During the night, refugees bound the red-eyed demon, Bran Hornin, to a tree, intent on ending his life. He was an ordinary man, but his red eyes and impenetrable gaze appeared monstrous to others. Among the crowd stood Moon. They wanted to kill a man, even though a true vampire stood before them. The girl could not leave him in such a state, and decided to rescue him. Her true identity was unveiled, yet Bran did not tremble in fear nor flee. Since then, the Hornin family had faithfully served Moon from one generation to the next. However, where this family dwelled, blood always flowed. Moon finally disclosed her purpose for coming. She required a ball crafted from werewolf hide and spider silk. Alan bowed respectfully and granted her request. The vampire was fatigued, so she settled into a chair. Suddenly, she heard the voices of children. They yearned to catch a glimpse of the visitor, but Moon acted swiftly, opening the cabinet door from where the sounds emanated. Inside, she found a red-haired boy and girl from the Hornin family, their eyes brimming with delight as they beheld Lady Moon. The little ones rejoiced at the encounter with Moon. The girl went by the name of Louise, while the boy wished to be called Judas instead of Judith. The vampire was already acquainted with them. Inadvertently, she addressed the boy as Judith and then Judy, causing his brow to furrow as he prepared to depart. However, Moon presented them with gifts, prompting the boy to change his mind and return. The siblings gazed curiously at the red pouch in the girl's hands, which contained sweets. Moon offered a candy to the still offended Judas. It proved to be exquisitely delicious, prompting Louise to take one as well. Following her brother's lead, Moon, Judas, and Louise proceeded to the living room. While the children discussed the candies, Moon contemplated. Initially, the birth of these twins seemed burdensome to her. She did not anticipate them being born as ordinary children. In the Hornin family, all descendants were composed and serene, yet they were all willing to lay down their lives for Moon. However, these two were different. Louise, albeit not adeptly, possessed the ability to express her emotions. On the other hand, Judas exhibited even greater potential. Perhaps that was why Moon desired to spend more time with them. It was easy to provoke Judas, but with the offering of delectable food, he swiftly regained his composure. The boy even wished to share with the vampire when their father, Alan Hornin, entered the living room. The man appeared incensed and beckoned Judas over, instructing him to behave appropriately in the presence of Lady Moon, while stroking his chin. Before departing, Moon handed the bag of candies to the children. In the dining room, Alan engaged in conversation with Moon, apologizing for his children's disrespectful conduct toward her, yet the vampire remained unruffled. Judas and Louise were growing swiftly. They had already reached the age of 8, yet Alan had not yet designated a successor. He intended to do so once they completed their education at the academy. After the birth of Frida, Moon found herself with a little respite, unaware of when her affection for the twins had blossomed. However, if the vampire were to meet her demise at Frida's hands, these children could escape the fate of serving the monstrous being. Alan spoke about the ball, entrusting its creation to a skilled artisan. What would take ordinary individuals years to accomplish, the Hornin family could achieve in a single day. The man presented Moon with a splendid box adorned with gold and crimson gemstones. Opening it, she discovered a key inside, meant for her mansion near the capital, prepared by Alan. Less than a week had elapsed since Moon requested Count Hornin to fashion a new identity for her. Within that time, he had procured the mansion, overseen its renovation, and employed a butler. Such was the nature of Alan Hornin. Moon required temporary sanctuary, as her ability to traverse shadows proved inconvenient during daylight hours. Alan had arranged a carriage, though Moon had little to carry, except for one troublesome element, the younger prince. Perhaps it was worth leaving him in the forest. It was peculiar, but the Hornin family consistently provided Moon with what she needed. The girl was unsure of the reason behind this, yet she relished it. Meanwhile, in the night within Moon's former abode in the forest, the prince still lay in bed, until suddenly his hand trembled. The Hornin family was the most well-informed lineage in the empire. With their assistance, Moon acquainted herself with the characters of the novel. However, there was an individual whom even this family had failed to locate for decades. It would be reckless to attempt to find a child who had not yet been born 10 years ago, particularly a commoner who ended up in an orphanage. We are speaking of Cynthia, the main protagonist. Before she turns 10, 2 significant events will occur. The first one should have already happened, and now she must be in the orphanage. At night, Moon embarked on her search alone. She aimed to locate Cynthia before the second event unfolded. She received information that over the past decade, the search area had narrowed down to the size of a continent. This indicated that something had indeed occurred. Hopefully, there would be some forthcoming results. Moon reached her sanctuary in the cursed forest and ascended to the room where the prince still lay. She held a notebook containing a concise summary of the hunter and the saint in her hands. Before Moon's book deteriorated further, its contents were transcribed, and the old entries were consigned to flames. The notebook was the sole item she carried with her during the move. As Moon turned away, the prince's hand grasped the blanket. In an instant, a peculiar sensation permeated Moon's consciousness. A feeling, rather than an emotion. It resembled an abrupt acquisition of knowledge. The boy regained consciousness, perplexed about his whereabouts. Heightened vigilance and confusion followed as other peculiar sensations arose. The prince recalled the image of an individual with silver hair and red eyes who had bitten him. Moon lowered her hood, the sun having already risen. A more emotionally inclined individual could have articulated it with greater precision, but the amalgamation of suppression, confusion, and resentment clearly did not belong to Moon. Could it be that the progenitor transmitted emotions to the lineage? Moon affirmed her lack of knowledge regarding the whereabouts and identity of that vampire. The prince's malevolent gaze met hers as his red eyes locked onto her. She falsely claimed to oversee one of his sanctuaries, hence lacking the right to know the owner's location. Moon intended to depart, but the boy halted her to inquire about her name and subsequently disclosed his own. Len beseeched Moon to accompany him, as he had now become part of the vampire's family. Without paying attention to her own sentiments, the girl understood him. The prince deliberately concealed his distress, having nearly perished during the pursuit. It was not unusual for a boy of his immaturity to transform into a creature of the night, a vampire. Initially, Moon refused to take him, but eventually, she agreed upon 3 conditions. Firstly, he must abstain from complaining about his attire, sustenance, and shelter. Secondly, he must not disturb Moon. Thirdly, if the vampire failed to appear within a year, Len would assuredly depart. Moon granted him a year, not out of profound affection, but once one takes someone under their wing, it becomes their duty to instruct them on how to live as a vampire. Within a year, he would acquire all the necessary knowledge and grow more self-reliant. Any delay would undoubtedly unveil Moon's true identity. Finally, Moon departed, instructing the boy to follow her if he agreed to the conditions. Len hurried onto the street, trailing the vampire, and they embarked on their journey. Moon had not yet reached her new abode, and already an unwelcome companion had appeared by her side. Moon finally settled in her new mansion and drank blood from a teacup. It was warm, as if she had just been taken. Standing next to her was the vampire servant hired by Alan. Her name was Wendy Rabbit. She took care of the mansion's cleaning, gardening, sleep preparations, and also slaughtered chickens every 3 days and offered blood to Moon. She was still young, but ruthlessly snapped the chickens' necks. Wendy knew from the beginning that Moon was a vampire, but still chose to work here. The vampire set aside the cup and looked at Wendy. Moon clarified if Lean received the same blood as her. He hadn't spoken since they arrived here, not even leaving his room. Wendy confirmed that he was feeding well, but Moon decided to take care of him herself. It pleased Rabbit to serve her, but her body tensed every time. For the first 2 weeks, Moon couldn't even remember the servant's name, or rather, didn't pay attention to it. It wasn't fear of the vampire. Wendy had simply never had such a kind and polite mistress before. The boy lay in his bed. It was very difficult for him to get up in the mornings, one of the consequences of becoming a vampire. There was a newspaper in Lean's room. Moon brought it because the prince didn't believe he had slept for 3 years. That didn't scare him at all. Lean's body slept, but his consciousness remained awake. He couldn't hear what was happening outside, but he thought a lot. One thought had troubled him throughout these 3 years. Lean would have preferred not to wake up at all, but now everything was fine. Moon entered the prince's room. He pretended to be asleep, but the girl caught him. Lean sat up. He broke one of the conditions, not eating. Moon handed him a vessel with blood and ordered him to drink, looking coldly into the frightened boy's eyes. The vampire opened the vessel. The smell of blood hit Lean's nose, but the boy refused to drink. Moon shouldn't be concerned whether he was hungry or not. As the founder, Moon understood the feelings of family, and hunger was no exception. She herself was not hungry, but if she simply ignored it, it would only become more annoying. Lean had not drunk blood for all 3 years he slept. There must have been a strong thirst tormenting him when he woke up. The reason Lean continued to refuse blood was that the prince wanted to die. He left the curtains open because vampires were vulnerable to sunlight. If that were the case, his family would have already perished. Since it didn't work, he started to starve. Moon sat on the bed and clasped Lean's cheeks with her hands. She didn't care whether he was hungry or not, but the prince would never be able to die, no matter how much he tortured himself. Moon pressed the boy's head into the bed. He gripped her hand with trembling hands. The vampire knew all the stages of hunger because she had experienced it all herself. She pressed on his jaw to open his mouth and began pouring blood into it. Lean desperately swallowed it and took hold of the vessel. His thirst was overwhelming, and he finally quenched it. Whether Lean drank blood or not, life would not be severed. But if such a thing were possible, Moon would have died 1,000 times already. The Moon approached Gemina with a query, inquiring if there were any resemblances between her family and the founder. The doctor immediately became intrigued. The Moon regretted bringing up the topic, for she could see in Gemina's eyes that there would be no turning back now. Gemina was rubbing a certain branch, a small divine twig that the Moon had brought her for examination at the doctor's request. The imperial family monopolized the rights to the divine tree. It was one of the magical wonders, hence access to it was forbidden. Majin, a realm inhabited by powerful monsters, was where high-ranking magicians had received special names. There were only 13 such magicians in total. Scattered across the world, these magicians resided in areas abundant with rare medicinal herbs and minerals. It was said that if one could return alive from there, they would amass great wealth, conquer those lands, and one would become the proprietor. However, mercenaries and nobles who sought to swiftly obtain such wealth never returned. Consequently, the realm of Magian fell under the rule of the imperial family, and access to it was strictly prohibited. The divine tree was an exceedingly rare monster. In reality, every tree in the forest had divine roots, making it perilous to venture there. Eventually, the imperial family began employing individuals who periodically pruned the tree to prevent its overgrowth. The moon grew bored as the doctor's narrative had dragged on. Finally, Jemina remembered the boy. Instead of burning under the rays of the sun, the prince fell into a deep slumber as if afflicted by narcolepsy. Even when he consumed all the blood provided by the moon, he immediately fell asleep. On that day, the vampire was more irritated than usual. For the past few centuries, the moon's heart had been devoid of turmoil. It resembled an untouched expanse of a lake, into which Leon had unexpectedly leaped. Perhaps the moon should have allowed him to perish. Swift and comfortable death was the aspiration of ordinary mortals. There was no need to establish a connection with him. Yet now, Leon was like a counterfeit moon. He closely resembled her former self. This seething sensation in the moon's chest was contempt. Jemina clarified for her. Turned vampires often possessed the same powers as the family's founder. The moon had simply shared a portion of her abilities with Leon. However, it was the vampire who transmitted his feelings and sensations to her, and the moon disliked it. He had been bestowed with the founder's power in a one-sided manner. It was never the other way around. Jemina, who had moved towards a shelf, found what she was searching for. It was a small vial containing a shimmering violet liquid, an unused poison for the moon. When Cynthia and Fred failed to kill her, Minna had created the poison as a contingency plan, as the vampire had requested. However, in its original form, this poison had never been utilized. Cynthia had declined to take the poison offered by Jemina, as she wanted to defeat the mistress of the moon by her own means. The moon, on the other hand, sought any opportunity to die with Jemina's assistance. The vampire agreed to drink the poison, even if the chances of success were slim. The moon imbibed every last droplet. Unfathomable agony pierced her being. Blood surged to her mouth as the maiden welcomed death with a smile. Yet a certain voice within her mind cried out, "No." The moon collapsed, yet she did not succumb. Everything came to a standstill. Jemina recorded the outcome. A minute had transpired. It proved to be too meager, and the vampire could not discern whose voice had spoken to her. The moon ascended. The poison had no effect, yet the only thing that troubled her was the voice in her mind. It wasn't Jemina, so was it a hallucination? However, it was too vivid to dismiss as imaginary. Finally, during the day, the moon returned to the Chevalier Manor. She entered Fred's room, which was more difficult to access than a palace. The boy was reading a book given to him by his father, but they did not speak. The book, along with a note, was passed to him through a slit beneath the door. Even Benjamin had yet to meet his son. Fred didn't want to harm his family. The boy read a book about monsters, complete with illustrations depicting their weaknesses. The moon encountered Arachnid in the book, and then saw herself. The book contained supposedly well-known information about the Moon Mistress. It was believed that she was the mightiest demonic monster unseen for over a century. This book was created by the Chevalier family and intended for internal use only. After all, for centuries, the only ones who had seen the Moon Mistress were members of this family. But the vampire had no recollection if it had truly been 100 years ago. The story of lifting the curse by defeating the Moon Mistress had been passed down from generation to generation within the Chevalier lineage. They periodically battled them to ensure they would not forget. The moon closed the book. Those were all excuses. She simply wanted to end her tedious eternal existence as quickly as possible. Even the strongest individuals on the continent couldn't leave a scratch on her. However, this child was the moon's only hope for death. The moon taught Fred how to play ball without it bursting, thereby taking the first steps towards teaching the boy to control his powers. He was making progress, but it was challenging. The strength in Fred's wrists alone was comparable to an average person's abilities. A week passed with their training. The instruction went smoothly as Fred gradually learned to control his powers. The current situation was a result of the body's inability to adapt quickly to the suddenly revealed talent, but fortunately, the moon was helping him. A voice was heard beyond the door. Fred froze in fear, but the moon reassured him and went to greet the guest. It was Hubin, the butler, who brought snacks. He wanted to carry them himself since he had been serving Fred for 3 years, but the moon insisted on having the tray handed over to her. The young man grew angry and vowed to return. Without fail, the vampire returned to the room where Fred was calming down, pushing the tray of treats. The boy hadn't even considered letting Hubin in because he still avoided encounters with people. However, the fact that he didn't hide in a corner upon hearing someone's voice was progress. Perhaps it was time for the moon to move on to the next stage. The moon and Benjamin discussed Fred's condition at the table. The Duke wanted his son to venture outside in 3 days. The reason behind it was the formal evening hosted by the Scheffelite family. There would be many children present, so Fred had to attend. The moon tensed up as this child still found it difficult to interact with others. However, Fred was the future duke who would have to meet with the emperor and numerous other nobles. It was crucial for the heir to start establishing connections from a young age to survive in the palace. The moon didn't see the necessity of hosting a party at this time. But it was already too late. Invitations had been sent out months ago, and canceling the event would damage their reputation. The moon continued to instruct Fred in controlling his power through the game of ball. When the boy was already quite adept, the vampire decided to summon someone. Fred became nervous and froze, but the moon reassured him. Vice Captain Sir Ian entered the room, whom the heir knew. The man was delighted to see Fred and rushed to embrace him, but he was restrained because the heir was still afraid of causing harm to others. Fred was on the verge of tears, and Sir Ian was taken aback. The moon thought that whenever Fred was mentioned, everyone in the estate became fools. Sir Ian joined the ball game. In the process, the vice captain let slip that Duke Scheffel considered the moon incredible and an excellent teacher, which unsettled the young woman. She had received hundreds of letters of recommendation in her name. It seemed that not many people desired to become Fred's mentor. After all, the future duke could easily abandon his studies after some time. The moon was much luckier than she thought. Aside from Fred, Healy Scheffel was the most talented in the family. Since they lived in the Northern Territory, the opportunity to see this family in person was not so high. When the conversation turned to Count Herning, Fred chimed in. When the heir learned that the moon had taught Louis and Judith, he became agitated and forcefully threw the ball at Ian. The moon ended the lesson so that the vice captain could leave. It appeared that he strained both his wrists catching the ball, but as a warrior, he endured the pain so that Fred wouldn't get nervous. The vampire wanted to continue working with Fred, but the boy withdrew again. The heir noticed that Sir Ian had been hurt. Whenever he achieved even a small success, he immediately retreated. The moon offered Fred various activities, but he sat in the corner and remained silent. The grand reception was only 2 days away. It would be difficult to rectify the situation. The moon was about to leave when Fred caught hold of her sleeve. The moon smiled, picked him up in her arms, and carried him to bed for him to rest. Fred felt embarrassed and covered his face with the blanket. He didn't understand why his teacher spoke to him informally. Indeed, the moon was completely different from ordinary people. She showed no respect for nobles or the imperial family. That's how she greeted the insignificant trash named Jack Scheffel. It was the moon who had the greatest influence on the upbringing of the Scheffel descendants. But apparently, it was indeed appropriate for her to use respectful address. Even if everything is fine now, it is not advisable to do so in front of third parties. Thus, the moon drew a line. She would only speak informally in private. It was now a secret known only to Fred and the moon. When Fred wasn't being capricious, he resembled a darling kitten to Moon. She worried if she could accomplish this within 2 days before the grand evening. Fred easily controlled his power in solitude, but in the presence of others, he would become nervous and lose focus. He was perturbed by the conversation with Sir Ian, thus unable to properly control his abilities. The fact that Ian got hurt because of him frightened Fred and closed the door to his heart once again. But something had changed. Fred grabbed her by the sleeve. If things had been the same as before, he wouldn't have reacted to Moon's departure. Now, the child who had withdrawn from the world decided to rely only on one person, Moon. The grand evening had arrived. The guests, dressed in luxurious attire, began to gather even during the day. Benjamin greeted Count Ceylon with a handshake. It was evident that there was tension between them. The gray-haired man hinted to the Duke about dreadful rumors concerning Fred, to which Benjamin elegantly put the Count in his place. Somehow, the Duke learned that Ceylon's son had almost been expelled from the academy, although he had been persistently trying to conceal it. The men tried to strike each other's weak spots, but Duke Benjamin ultimately emerged victorious. The conversation then transitioned into a friendly discussion about the banquet. Whispers about Fred circulated among the assembled nobles. The only thing that interested them was whether the rumors were true. Even if people continued to pose this question, Benjamin merely smiled predatorily. This only further fueled their curiosity. The Duke tapped his spoon against his glass to capture the attention of the crowd. He announced that Fred would come out to greet the guests and then retire, as he was unwell. All heads immediately turned. Fred walked hand in hand with Moon. When everyone saw that the hare was just an ordinary child, they instantly lost interest. But the boy was still nervous, gripping Moon's hand tightly. If an ordinary person had been in her place, their bones would have been shattered. Fred and his teacher returned to the room. Moon praised the boy. Fred felt embarrassed. It was all thanks to his teacher holding his hand. The girl looked at him in surprise and went for a snack. The situation was improving, but her intervention carried too great a weight. Fred could stand before others when Moon was by his side, but it meant that he depended on her. The boy still relied on Moon, and when things worsened, it transformed into dependence. Fred would grow up and likely forget the teacher who played with him, but it wouldn't matter when he beheaded the mistress of the Moon. Moon returned to the banquet hall. There, she encountered Count Herning, who had also been invited to the party. He decided to personally check if Moon was satisfied with her mansion. Benjamin approached them, surprised that Count Herning had attended their gathering. Alan, on the other hand, apologized, stating that he had come to visit a former colleague whom he had recommended. But now that she worked for the Scheffels, the Count had nothing to worry about. There was an evident antipathy between the men as they bore piercing gazes at each other, leaving Moon amazed. Moon couldn't comprehend why Alan was angry. Suddenly, Herning leaned towards her, whispered that the doors of his county were always open to her, handed her a piece of cake, and stepped away. Astonished, Moon left with the plate, leaving the men alone. In reality, Alan handed her a note, and his actions were intended to divert attention. Moon unfolded the paper. The search for the girl narrowed down to 3 places. The Hernins were only looking for one individual, Cynthia, the main heroine of the novel. The next day, Fred lay in his bed with a damp cloth on his forehead. The boy had a fever. Moon was by his side and called for a doctor to examine him. Fred, touching the teacher's hand, agreed. Suddenly, Duke Benjamin entered the room, concerned about his son's well-being. Fred's temperature had risen, and his throat was inflamed. These were symptoms of a severe cold, not the flu. Serious illnesses were extremely rare in the Scheffel family, but the Duke was inconsolable. Finally, everyone left the boy to rest. The cloth slipped off Fred's face, causing him to wake up. Moon was in the room, so she gently laid the hair back to rest. The illness was minor, and Fred was expected to recover quickly. Among the descendants of the Scheffel family, very few cases of serious illness were observed. In addition to their talent, the Scheffels were also born with robust health. Fred struggled to control his overwhelming strength. Only recently had he managed to stabilize it during training. The main cause of his illness was the grand evening. Although Fred's appearance was made possible only by Moon's presence, the feeling that he could confidently stand before such a large number of people had given him assurance. After this ordeal, Fred would be able to fully control his power. Suddenly, Fred asked Moon if he would be able to play outside when he recovered. Until now, he had only ventured into the garden, but now he wanted to go outside, which shocked his teacher. She, of course, agreed, and then went out for the medications. However, the doctor didn't have them. The servant who took the pills appeared familiar to the doctor. Moon rushed to Fred immediately. She swung open the doors of his room and saw Hubin, who was bringing a cart with snacks. His peculiar expression didn't bode well. Fred sat trembling on the bed. Moon tried to reach out to him, but the boy painfully struck her hand, leaving a red mark. He was simply in despair. Hubin had lied to Fred, claiming that the teacher was angry with him. Things were going poorly. Fred should not have been preoccupied with such matters. The moon had no choice but to resort to the magic of darkness. A vampire struck her in the nape of the neck, a place that evokes no painful sensations, in order to lull Fred into slumber. The moon cast a contemptuous glance at Hubin. She commenced pressing him with inquiries, but the servant remained resolute. The young master obstinately refused to ingest his medicine, while Hubin merely sought to extend assistance. However, the moon discerned his deceit, prompting Hubin to erupt in laughter. According to Hubin, the moon spent an excessive amount of time with Fred. Yet she was merely a recent instructor, whereas he was a faithful servant who would remain in the company of the young master even as he matured. For the sake of this position, Hubin had engaged in protracted and arduous struggles against numerous competitors. He endured various forms of humiliation solely to attain the title of the next duke's servant, yet a certain teacher surpassed him. Hubin could not allow everything to go to waste. He had always been by the young master's side until Fred secluded himself in his chamber. Now that the boy's condition was ameliorating, Hubin's plan entailed intervening and disrupting their trusting rapport in order to become the closest aide to the next duke. The moon was beginning to grow incensed. Darkness coalesced around her in dense clusters, unbeknownst to Hubin. A few words proved sufficient to undermine a person's self-assurance. Due to Hubin's influence, Fred now believed that the moon was afflicted, as she sat here with him day after day. The 10-year-old boy lacked the fortitude to withstand such cunning words and deeds. The moon's stability wavered due to the pain. The chamber descended into darkness. And then 2 large eyes glowered malevolently at Hubin from the shadows, prompting the man to emit a scream of terror. The guards stormed into the room. The moon sat quietly by Fred's bedside, trembling. Hubin lay on the floor. Subsequently, Duke Benjamin entered. The guards had already hoisted the servant and removed him. His intrusion into Fred's chamber and the commotion he caused were deemed unacceptable. Benjamin expelled everyone from the room and inquired about his son's well-being. One could terminate a person's life without leaving any traces. However, if a servant were to vanish from the mansion, it would yield dire consequences. Ordinary individuals, upon encountering the Lady of the Moon, instantaneously freeze and can scarcely move. Yet the moon adeptly suppressed her power and could calmly interact with humans. The vampire merely opened a tightly sealed valve, yet Hubin was seized by terror and could hardly marshal his thoughts. Now he would never present himself before Fred again. It was a simple and trite punishment inflicted upon him by the moon. Meanwhile, in the moon's abode, Lean, who had been slumbering on the couch, inexplicably shuddered. He was roused by the whispering of dark magic near his ear. The boy touched the site where he had been bitten. A sense of unease gripped him, as if something peculiar had occurred. Lean once again unexpectedly dozed off during the day. Such an occurrence had never transpired prior to his transformation into a vampire. The prince perceived the presence of only one individual, but it appeared that the moon had already withdrawn. The person who collaborated with the vampire frequented the Sheffley estate, a circumstance that seemed peculiar to Lean. He ventured into the boiler room, where a cast-iron cauldron glistened with molten gold, while a crackling fire burned beneath it. These sensations weighed heavily upon Lean. He recollected the counsel imparted by the moon, advising him not to fixate on the entirety of his emotions. Finally, the young lad calmly exhaled and departed the premises. Since being infused with the moon's blood, she had taken to visiting him with increased frequency. The girl's words proved to be advantageous. Currently, Lean harbored no resentment towards the moon, yet he also harbored no inclination to draw nearer to her, for she appeared to possess an intense self-loathing, and Lean stood as her reflection in the looking-glass. The sole individual who regularly graced the prince's chamber was Wendy. Seated upon a verdant meadow in the garden, Lean experienced the descent of a chilling droplet of water upon his person. Today, his mind remained lucid even in the presence of the sun. Nevertheless, he came to the realization that he had endeavored to bring an end to his own existence. Leandro Noche bore the mantle of the second prince. The reigning emperor had sired 3 children from 2 empresses. The second empress boasted formidable familial ties, yet her political standing remained feeble, whereas the influence of the first empress held considerable sway. The empire was slated to commemorate the momentous ceremony marking the ascension of the first princess, an event no less than a symbol of triumph for the sole survivor of the ferocious clash for the throne. As the coming-of-age ceremony of Princess Herike loomed near, the palace gradually succumbed to a deluge of blood. The first empress, accompanied by her youngest son, the third prince, sought to confront Herike and her younger brother Lean prior to the ceremonial affair. However, the resourceful princess managed to secure her safeguarding by garnering the support of several nobles and guards. Consequently, Leandro became the target of the sword. Despite their kinship, such ties held no sway in the ruthless contest for the throne. Nevertheless, as a third prince remained, he became the primary object of their apprehension. Hence, Herike and Lean maintained a transient alliance, and as Leandro made his way towards the villa, he found himself forced to evade a monstrous adversary. It happened to be the very day when the moon came to the boy's rescue. Only 3 years later did Leandro open his eyes once again. He stood in stark contrast to his sister. Herike had been destined to ascend to empresshood. Her countenance, cold disposition, calculating nature, and even her habit of meticulously scrutinizing every situation and reaching judicious decisions bore a striking resemblance to her mother. Herike harbored no qualms about eliminating all her siblings to claim the throne. Had it not been for the third prince, Lean would have stood first in line to confront Herike's sword. Alternatively, he would have met his demise at the hands of the first empress. Presently, Lean found himself condemned to live out the remainder of his days as a vampire, yet the desire to embrace life had yet to manifest within him. However, the moon had conveyed that death eluded him. Lean stood obligated to persist in his existence, even when beset by adversity along his path. The moon arrived at the meadow. She presumed that the boy wanted to escape. Lean grew angry because he was merely taking a stroll, yet the moon suddenly tied the scarf around his neck, the same one Fred wore when he had a cold. Lean had to conceal the bite marks when he went out. Then the moon left him, still not paying him much attention. But for some reason, Lean blushed. That was why he didn't want to leave. In the Sheffley estate, the moon and Fred engaged in a game of hide-and-seek. The young lady sat by the window when the hare suddenly leaped into her arms. Now it was the moon's turn, but she suggested playing an indoor game instead. Duke Benjamin reinforced the prohibition of his son's access to the room upon witnessing Hubert's presence inside. As soon as Fred expressed his desire to play hide-and-seek, Benjamin promptly expelled all the staff from the mansion. Not much time had passed since the moon arrived, yet the boy felt significantly better now. It seemed that the moment had arrived. The moon encountered Benjamin in the same banquet hall. The Duke was already seated at the table, and the young lady joined him. Benjamin deemed it appropriate to grant Fred his freedom. In truth, the moon anticipated such an outcome, and thus she was not surprised. Furthermore, the objective had already been achieved. Fred no longer harbored fear when interacting with others and had become quite adept at harnessing his power. Therefore, Benjamin concluded that this was sufficient. Any further influence from a teacher might give rise to complications. The moon was not to inform Fred of her dismissal until his birthday. This summer, Benjamin planned to return to the duchy. The lunar maiden was to journey to the Scaly Castle, located at the heart of the northern duchy, serving as the Sheffley stronghold. Visiting this residence was a great honor for anyone. However, a problem arose. As the moon transformed into a vampire at night, her sleeping quarters needed to be inaccessible to humans. Thus, the young lady declined, leaving Benjamin perplexed. The Duke chuckled and asked if the moon had a place where she could stay in the duchy. However, the vampire maiden was uncertain if such a place existed near the Scaly Castle, where there would be fewer people. As the moon descended the staircase, she was approached by a young man dressed in black. He had a lackluster gaze and an impassive countenance. Even the ordinary knights were not trained as rigorously as this assassin, indicating his origin in Horneno. He was assigned to accompany the moon home. A man in a black cloak emerged from the carriage and assisted the moon in boarding. Beneath the hood stood Alan Hornan. It was peculiar that he had undertaken such a lengthy journey solely to meet the moon. If Alan intended to transport her home, he would have arranged for a new carriage. This suggested that he had planned for a joint journey, but what was the purpose behind it? The Moon noticed a brown suitcase on the carriage floor, and it turned out that Alan had something to communicate to the young lady. Moon and Alan arrived at the vampire's manor. Hornin had 3 significant tidings. The initial one was that they had arranged a lavish villa for Moon within the duchy. Not much time had elapsed since their departure from the Sheffley Palace, where they had reached an accord to venture to the duchy, and Alan was already cognizant of it. Hence, he possessed his informants and connections there. The second message pertained to Duke Sheffl's intention to conquer the domain of the werewolves. The impetus behind this aspiration was the fragment of Nile. The shards of the sword had been scattered across 13 realms, yet the Sheffels had only managed to locate one. The other 2 fragments were discovered within the realms of the monsters. The Sheffels possessed unparalleled prowess in hunting down creatures, but their power proved inadequate for subjugating the realms. Then Moon emerged. Whenever the Sheffley family endeavored to seize one of the kingdoms, the vampire intervened. In the original account, Fred matured, gradually conquering one realm after another. Thus Moon diligently kept watch over the fragments of Nile, ultimately enabling him to vanquish all the monster realms. Consequently, none but Fred should undertake the conquest of the werewolf domain. The werewolf territories, situated in close proximity to Moon's dominions, presented a formidable challenge to conquer, yet the Sheffels deliberately selected them. The vampire would address this matter in due course. And finally, the third revelation. Alan had discovered Cynthia Greywood. She was a young lady adorned with silver tresses and ebony eyes. The solitary hunter Fred would never be able to slay Moon. Only by harnessing the power of sanctified forces could hope for triumph be kindled. In the original narrative, scant information was provided regarding Cynthia's childhood. The clues Moon could provide to Hornin were meager. Nevertheless, Alan managed to trace a lineage bearing the appellation Greywood. He also acquired intelligence regarding children dwelling in an orphanage under the auspices of a clergyman. Alan handed the roster to Moon. According to those documents, Cynthia's place of residence was an orphanage. Suddenly, a knock resounded at the door. It was Lean bearing a tray. He had come due to Wendy's preoccupation. Alan fixed his gaze directly upon Lean's crimson orbs. Hornin appeared both vexed and intrigued simultaneously. Lean became disconcerted, and Moon commanded him to depart. Alan was taken aback by the abrupt appearance of the vampire. Upon learning the lad's name, he offered a peculiar smile. Lean retreated into his chamber and leaned against the door, gasping for breath. Alan Hornin had recognized him.